This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, this is Teachers Talk Radio, and welcome to the Friday Lunch Show with Morgan Whitfield and Todd Brennan. It is Friday, November 22nd, and today we will be discussing curriculum. More specifically, we will be looking at curriculum intent. Let's explore how to build and sequence a powerful curriculum. Listen, text, and call in. We look forward to a great show.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio, the Friday Lunch Show. This is with Morgan and Todd. And Todd, how are you doing today?
Really good, really good. Had a lovely week. How about you?
Yeah, gorgeous. It's always nice to do this on a Friday because I feel it's my treat at the end of a long week to discuss something really fun. And I'm really excited to discuss curriculum today.
Yeah, that's probably diagnosable that both of us see this as a treat, right?
Yeah.
What do you like to do on a Friday? Talk about education. It's a real treat. But no, it is. And this format, when we do it like this, reminds me of kind of how the sort of the beginning of the thought of doing this started, which is us just sending voice notes back and forth and thinking eventually we should inflict this on the world, or at least a small proportion of the world.
Well, I think especially this topic, one of the very first things that you sent me a long, long time ago was a piece of writing by Joshua Valance. And it was absolutely fantastic. It was a really great piece that was eventually published in a series in his blog. But it really beautifully put together and kind of articulated a lot of my thoughts on curriculum intent. And I just remember printing off and putting notes all over it. So I thought, this is a great topic. This is a great place to start because curriculum is something that is always on our mind as teachers, and it's always an unfinished product. What were your thoughts? Just why did you want to talk about curriculum today?
Yeah, well, I've actually got my copy of Josh's documents in front of me as well, all covered in lots of pencil markings. I remember annotating it on an aeroplane, and one of the passengers, I was kind of sat with one child and my wife was sat with another. We've since added another edition, but the woman who was sat with my wife was like, "What is he doing?" And she's like, he's annotating a document about curriculum. We work in schools. And she's like, I remember she said, "Is that normal?" And my wife just sort of shook her head and went, "No."
I think it is normal though. So I was thinking today, it is normal because teachers are always working on curriculum. And I think we're always thinking about it. I'm going through kind of two examples that are just fresh in my mind. The first was I was thinking about our English department at school and how they are doing a huge body of work because they've decided to switch exam boards. And alongside that comes a switch with curriculum. So the text that you might be teaching, but also how you're teaching it and how that might affect what you are doing further down the school. So it's a huge thing to kind of have a curriculum kind of switch on you that is maybe kind of external. But I think there's a lot of work internally too. I was looking at our science department, and right now we have a massive, huge, wildly successful science department, but they have 3 different disciplines. And what they'd like to do at Key Stage 3 is not look separately at physics, at chemistry, and at biology, but instead make sure that students become scientists first. And that it's not that they're kind of separated and segregated into these different streams, but instead they have more of a skills-based approach. So those are 2 very different reasons for changing curriculum. And there's going to be 2 very different ways of going about building those curriculums. And there's no perfect way to build curriculum, basically because it's the engine. I like how you always say curriculum is the engine of what we do, but it's also the engine of the airplane that we are building as we're flying it a lot of the time. So that's just my few very tangible examples to get into something that can be quite abstract.
Yeah, and also, you've talked there, I think we often get confused between exam boards, national curriculums. I mean, just in the Middle East, we often hear people, I interviewed for a few positions last year as I'd kind of decided that it was time to move from the school I was at the time. Had a life cycle at that school and wanted a new challenge. Was always the same. It's like, well, what do you mean by curriculum? And quite often what they meant was exam board, and they'd talk about the British curriculum, which of course doesn't exist. There's the English national curriculum, and it's can be a bit of a confusion for departments that they think an exam board is a curriculum. It's not necessarily. It might be indicative of a curriculum. It might suggest some changes at Key Stage 3 in your curriculum, but it isn't within itself a curriculum. So it might be worth just kind of starting by what we think, because there isn't really a great consensus on what we mean by curriculum. I mean, I think we all know this, but I'm going to pretend that nobody knows this. I'm going to really show off. Are we aware it means race course?
Sorry, what?
Yeah, apparently. So apparently it's the word's roots are Latin in origin and meaning race course. Josh Valance points this out. And I think I'd read it elsewhere before, reading this kind of, I guess it's a handbook, isn't it, of sorts, an overview of the whole topic area. So what do you understand by, when we're talking about curriculum, because I've sort of said a few things I think it isn't, what do you understand by it? What do you mean when you mean curriculum?
Well, I think I understand what you mean when you say race course. It's a course of study. But I think national curriculum is one thing, and exam board is another thing. But I always go to Mary Myatt and Christine Council, and I really love the way that they interpret curriculum. And I think it's Christine Council who really goes into the idea of curriculum as a story that needs to be told in a very layered way, that it is like a novel. And I really love that analogy, that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you could, if you had a novel, put out 20 bullet points of key information, of actions and things, maybe characters and plot points. But that is not what makes a model. There's so much more depth and detail and re-emerging themes and linkages and connections that we make, that we have to interpret and explain through our own lenses. So a curriculum is so much more than a simple sequencing of information that has to do with a specific academic discipline. It is something that is complex. And because of how we tell that story, we have to be really thoughtful and intentional about it. That's my understanding of curriculum. Not we're teaching to this text or to an exam board's bullet points. It's not a syllabus. It's something much richer and deeper than that.
Yeah, and because you're far more intelligent than I am, I would just say it's the what and when. And actually, your answer gives that fullness. It is the story, it's the layers beneath that what and when. But honestly, before I started reading about curriculum, when everyone used to talk about it's the next big thing in education, haven't you read the government's new curriculum document? I always just thought, why are we talking about curriculum again? It's what and when. Let's move on. What are we teaching? When are we teaching it? So I think for a lot of people, that what you've just given, that illumination of exactly what we mean when we say curriculum, is really important, because genuinely on interview, the number of people who asked me about how I would manage changing curriculum, and I just essentially said to them, everyone who joins your school is changing curriculum, in a very nice way.
That is that's incredibly insightful. I think that's a brilliant point. That's exactly it.
Yeah, and so it's a little bit, it's often talked about in slightly reductive terms. And yeah, I have to credit me butchering Mary Myatt is absolutely not me. It's not original me. Mary Myatt states in her book on curriculum, we need to reframe the key stage 3 as the intellectual and cognitive powerhouse of the school. So that's not me. Before you credit me with that phrase, that's me butchering Mary Myatt.
Well, I think it's funny. I think that you talk about curriculum as being the what and the when. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's certainly where I started, and I appreciate your illumination on it. That is much more where I ended up. And
Well, I think it's yeah, I think it's really funny because I agree. There's the what and the when. I'd also add the who. I think that curriculum, especially in the last decade or so, has taken a huge turn and it's kind of said, well, who is telling the story? And
yeah,
I think that's why we see so many movements where teachers are actively diversifying and decolonizing their curriculum. They are looking at the context of the students who are sitting in front of them.
yes.
I think they're looking at their own biases that they bring to the table when delivering curriculum, and they're unpacking those. So I think the who, when it comes to curriculum, is mattering more than ever. And it's really great because I think it's actually making teachers quite reflective in their teaching and they're interrogating the knowledge just as critically as we want our students to interrogate it.
Yeah, and that might be the thing that you've said there. That might be actually originally mine. The idea of a values curriculum as a start point before actually deciding on content curriculum. I haven't read that elsewhere, and I think I remember sending that to you and to Barry Smith maybe around 2 years ago. So I might take some credit for that. But exactly, I've written down here in my notes on the document. For me, curriculum is the what and the when, and then I add to that, I say deciding on what, privileging, must find its explanation in, and then I've got a nice list here, a vision of education linked to the context, an idea about your subject, its purpose, its component parts. The national curriculum, that's more a statutory requirement, obviously, in many settings. Endpoint exams, future utility of said knowledge and skills. And then I've underlined and put, most importantly, values, community, societal, and aspirational. And it's that part for me that really is the beginning of revisiting a curriculum, not your endpoint exams. But I think you have to start from your values because, to butcher Simon Sinek, I just read a lot of clever people and then ruin what they've said. But Simon Sinek points out that if we start with the why, everything else becomes a lot simpler. And I think, is it Solzhenitsyn as well? A man who understands the why can bear any how.
Well,
So
I
the
think
why is really important, and the values are the
the why
why for
is
me.
important. I think that I think that when we look at curriculum, we started talking about values curriculum a while ago. And I think I really want to go into kind of depth and explore what you mean when you say values curriculum. Imagine we sitting around a table. I am a new teacher to your school. I'm sitting around with 10 other English teachers, and you say, well, we're going to start rebuilding or redrafting our curriculum. And let's start from a values approach. What does that look like? What does that first discussion look like? And how do you explain that to teachers who are also sitting around that table?
Yeah, so one thing is actually I might not start with that with a new teacher, just to be really transparent there. I think that's probably a conversation you have later once they've kind of seen. I think that could be quite overwhelming. And although the why is important, I think that might be a little overwhelming. But if I was going to do that, and there'd be value to it, I think I'd say that, as a community, a school community, it's really important that we reflect the values of the wider community, of the whole school community, and of the society that we're based in. The reason for that is that the information will challenge in the wrong way if it comes from anywhere else. So what I mean by that is, for instance, in the UK, every year we have Remembrance Day. Now, my family background would be Irish, but I certainly see the value in remembering those soldiers who made huge sacrifice for the freedom of the nation. That's fairly self-evident. And so if you're thinking that one of our values is about celebrating, respecting the British society that we live in, and starting from a point of understanding some of the positive aspects of that, that's one way of approaching your curriculum, and that's going to influence your decision. I'll give you an example from a subject I don't teach. If I was a history teacher teaching World War One, and my orientation for teaching World War One is it comes up later in GCSE. That's very, very different to if my orientation is it's important that these students know that the world that we live in now was founded on certain sacrifices made by certain individuals. So that obviously is a very different orientation for starting them with the knowledge that comes after that. So that's why I'd start with it as the beginning point. And that's what I mean by it's like, what do we as a community believe? What do the community that we serve believe? What does the society believe? Because I think that it's important that there's unity in what we teach as well, and challenge. There has to be some challenge of concepts. So a family that grow up believing, for instance, that World War One had no, I'm going to show my lack of history knowledge here, but that there was no empirical desires in that war, and that those sacrifices made by those men didn't come with some conflict. That I mean more than physical conflict, obviously. That might be something that we decide to address, but we have to start outwards from what the community and the society believe and what they value, because I think everything else then is underpinned by that.
I think it's really interesting, even that specific example that you gave. So we could start, if we were looking at values, are we looking at patriotism or nationalism? Is that something we're trying to impart? Or is it that we want to look at kind of nationalism as a way to interrogate and give our students some type of media literacy to understand propaganda at the time? So I think that's what a historical approach might be. If you're a history teacher, there are different values definitely that you can imbue into how you teach the exact same topic. I was just thinking about Michael Young, because I think that that's a really great way to kind of look at knowledge. And I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about powerful knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just tidy that off by saying, that what I've said there about World War One and what you've raised there about nationalism and patriotism, that really does depend on what community you're serving. And I spoke about this at Research Ed, which is that I come from a community that in the 90s and the 80s was incredibly divided. And it was a strange sort of divide because it was between immigrant families who had been under colonial rule. And yet the strange thing is, as a mill town that helped end slavery, and that's not too grand a term, and I can elaborate on that if it's of interest, but the people of the town, the Christian people of the town, helped end slavery in America by refusing to work with the cotton that was produced there. They felt that it was not a Christian value to work with that material, which had a knock-on effect. Wasn't obviously the only thing. And yet it wasn't just the Christians, it was the immigrants, recent immigrants from India and from what we would now call Pakistan. So despite being a city divided, there was actually an awful lot of shared values and a shared history and a shared power between those communities. Now, I would say that idea of unity and the history of the city, if taught properly, could help to heal some of the wounds of earlier generations. But in two schools that I visited, I didn't see either school celebrating any sort of civic pride. And I asked the leaders about it, and it wasn't something that they prioritized within their curriculum. So that's just to kind of illuminate on that example, because I think it is really important that the curriculum begins with a sense of what are our values, what would we like to impart on the children. And you're right, some of that can be addressing issues of propaganda and the more negative aspects of national pride.
I think it's really interesting. I think that shared values are exactly that. And the reason I kind of go back to like having all your teachers around the table to talk about curriculum intent is that it's really easy to have your curriculum kind of misconstrued or kind of taught in a half-hearted way. So it's really all about being on the same page of that novel and have an understanding of reading the whole book before you teach it, because how do teachers interpret and implement? I was just thinking while you were talking, that's actually a perfect example of powerful knowledge. So the idea that Michael Young has kind of developed and popularized when it comes to powerful knowledge is that we have knowledge that gives us power. And it was kind of a response that he articulated in response to knowledge of the powerful, that it used to be in schools that there was knowledge that you were given. So if you were taught at a school and you spoke a certain way and you learned certain things, then this was kind of elite knowledge, and it gave you power and almost class and privilege because you knew these things more than other students or more than other people. So it gave you access that perhaps others wouldn't have. And the opposite of that would be powerful knowledge, which is kind of this democratization of knowledge that he kind of broke down in three ways. The first way was that students would have access to knowledge that was really specialized and academic, so very systematically conceptualized. It's very much, here are the academic disciplines, and that's knowledge on the very first level, that first kind of surface idea of knowledge. The second idea of knowledge, that it provides learners with ways to understand the world beyond their experience. So I might be able to label a flower, but I might not be able to understand reproduction in plant life. So that is beyond my experience. So if I'm able to label a flower, that's one thing. That's a very kind of academic discipline, very, very kind of simple knowledge. Being able to understand photosynthesis is on top of that. It's beyond my immediate experience. And then the third level of knowledge, which I think is really what you get when you have a values curriculum, is that you're equipping learners with the tools that they need to respond to complexity, that they are able to interrogate knowledge, that they're able to challenge assumptions. So that's kind of the third level that you get. But you need to build up a massive schema of knowledge before you can actually interrogate it properly. I was talking to a friend recently about AI and ChatGPT, and we were saying sometimes if you ask ChatGPT something, it gives you something back, and you know from reading it that it is mostly nonsense and wrong. It's like it knows just enough to confidently fake an interview, if you will, and knows just enough to say something very superficial. But unless you had that depth of understanding yourself, you probably look at it and say, oh, that's pretty smart. So we want to make sure that curriculum equips those learners with the tools and enough knowledge, a wide breadth of it, but and enough depth of it that they can then interrogate something and have a more complete understanding of it. So I think your example of what you just gave in terms of that town, that's fascinating. Unity there and values there, having that understanding, that seems like something that's really powerful to impart, but it involves a lot of contextual knowledge around that specific event, for instance.
Yeah, and it's a really niche example and a really niche event.
Yeah, it's a great niche example.
Yeah, it was covered on the In Our Time podcast, and I think it's a really interesting example. But it's more interesting in fact as how divided the city has been, and yet shared ancestry made huge sacrifices, essentially for equality. And so for those communities that made those huge sacrifices, they went without pay. Just to be very clear, they went without pay until slavery stopped for quite an extended time period. And the owners of the factories also supported them. So there was huge suffering for the owners, for the workers, and the workers were not purely Christian, but that was the start point of the ideology and the new immigrants to the country, although they would have been part of empire, so they may very well not have felt that way. They also agreed and thought it was unethical to work with this material. So they all sacrificed. And something that's so unifying, you'd imagine, would be covered, and yet neither school, who served two very different communities. One served the predominantly Indian and Pakistani community, and the other very Catholic Christian community. Neither were covering any aspect of civic connections there. Anyway, I digress heavily. I like the AI example because it really neatly points out that the ability to ask good questions comes from that deep knowledge, and the querying of that knowledge that is presented to you again comes back to this idea of curriculum and what's covered, and in what sequence it's covered. We probably are going a little bit off piste here, aren't we? But that is what we do.
That is what we do. I think there's something with curriculum. I think it's really fascinating. Even you have told a story, and I think that if you are telling the story of how slavery was opposed in this town, I think what's really interesting is you have to have at the very first level an understanding a lot of those keywords. You use things like words like empire, slavery. You talked about the differences between different communities, so you'd probably have to have understanding of like the different players. So when you talk about Christians as opposed to new immigrants and the context that they came from, there's a lot there that you have to know outside
Yeah,
of a lot of knowledge outside to have a better understanding of what unity means in that context. And I think that's the thing about curriculum. A lot of the times it's how do you start? How do you layer that knowledge? How do you sequence it? How do you go back and then build out that schema properly? And a lot of the times when we are building curriculum, what's really hard is we only have so much space to tell so many stories. So, what
absolutely.
stories are we going to tell? And how can we tell them with the most impact and that will give our students the most kind of knowledge rich well to draw from, at the same time, allowing them to kind of go in depth as well so that they can investigate and have a further understanding. Does that make
Absolutely.
sense?
It does, and that's what I'm was I was trying, or maybe it was inarticulately trying to explain to you before we started, was that idea of the disparate pieces of information not fitting into the sequence. I think when in the hands of an inexperienced teacher, a poorly sequenced curriculum can create that, can cause that schema to be even harder to make sticky, to use an expression.
Yes.
And so when we say curriculum is the engine or curriculum is the powerhouse, as she's speaking particularly about Key Stage 3, I think it's not just that it's the powerhouse of what happens in the building and what students learn. It's not just the race course. It's also your support mechanism for teachers who perhaps are new to the profession and know that they need to do some retrieval practice at some point. But if that is poorly sequenced, or it's not optimally sequenced, let's say that, then they're struggling immediately because they're doing a thing and they would turn to you and say, I'm doing the thing. I did the thing we discussed. And yet it still is not becoming sticky. The schema is still not forming. And of course, the answer to that is, well, it's actually been really poorly sequenced by people who ought to know better. So I hope that clarifies that point, because I think that's a really important point, actually, that this is about not just equity in terms of content and coverage, but actually in terms of developing teachers and in terms of student experience as well. So yeah, we are jumping around, but I definitely wanted to stop on that at some point. I'm also really intrigued by this idea that you've said about Michael Young. So what should we put a pin in here?
Well, I think the Michael Young's Powerful Knowledge, I think it's just, I really like it as a lens, like these
Yeah,
three layers of kind of like having a lot of knowledge that's specialized and conceptualized. Then making sure that learners can describe the world, explain it beyond their immediate experience, because we're giving them a lot of tools then to kind of understand beyond what's immediately in front of them and what they are experiencing in their everyday life. And then the step on top of that is that we're equipping learners to interrogate knowledge. And I hate using critical thinking because I think that that's an overused term. I remember having to tag my schemes of work with 21st century skills, and we just tagged everything with critical thinking, kind of
yeah,
rendering the term meaningless. I think
yeah,
what we mean is thinking critically, interrogating and challenging something to see what's behind it. And again, if I went back to history as a subject discipline, I say, well, what's the provenance of that knowledge? What was the intention behind it? I think there's a lot of analysis that's involved in that, and it takes a lot of knowledge to then challenge something. So you have to know, well, what's off here? What's missing? What's wrong? Where did this come from? Who are the actors? What is the bias? So yeah, I think those three layers are really fascinating.
you've said
I
two
think
of
we're
my
gonna.
favorite. You've said two of my favorite things. Can we come back to critical thinking, and can we come back to 21st century skills just quickly, and then we'll go on from there, because I want to interrogate this idea of powerful knowledge some more.
Well, actually, why don't we do that first, and then we'll go in an eye break. Tell me, what are your immediate thoughts? Because
Right.
now I'm
So
curious.
come on, you know what I'm going to say about critical thinking and 21st century skills immediately. 21st century skills,
you hate them. You hate them.
presumably 21st century skills is Mad Max. It's Cormac McCarthy's The Road. It's digging ourselves out of little trenches after the nuclear disaster. It's hunting for food and checking that it's still okay to eat. Because, of course, there's a natural environmental climate disaster coming and there's nuclear apocalypse coming, and we all are able to predict the entirety of the 21st century. So it must be those things, of course. Next, critical thinking is I think this is, I don't know why I'm taking this one actually, because I think it's pretty much settled now, isn't it? Critical thinking is domain specific. I think that's largely accepted. But yet you still see it in schools. We still see people talking about how are we going to enable them to be critical thinkers across our subject areas. And you think, well, no, you're not. There's no sort of mad skill of inference that can just work across basketball and poetry analysis. It doesn't exist. But the thing I want to ask you about powerful knowledge, just to stop myself ranting for a second, is the idea that you take someone, for example, who's from what I would call, it's the background I'm from, I'd call it an underprivileged background. It's not quite accurate, but let's just call it that for now. Working class, classic working class background, UK terms, council estate. And are you saying, or rather is Jung saying, that just to tell them about the things that the powerful people, the agreed establishment or the elite, whatever you want to refer to them as, and the knowledge that goes along with that, teaching them about that is wrong? Is that the idea? I'm a bit confused there.
This is absolutely fascinating, because the knowledge of the elite, the knowledge of the powerful says, I know all about old white man history. That's very Eurocentric and Western. It's a version of history, for instance. And so if we were to say the national curriculum, if we want to empower everyone, we give them all that elite knowledge about this Eurocentric white man history. Sorry, that's me generalizing very widely, but we're giving them that. Now, that is a massive disservice, because what we are doing then is we are not telling the stories of everyone else who might be marginalized and vulnerable, or let's say they are not represented at all. Their history, their gender, their ethnicity, their orientation, everything like that is not represented in the curriculum. Their stories aren't being told. And we do a disservice in curriculums because people don't see themselves in them, so they don't think that they can participate or engage in it in an active way. And the other thing we do is if someone does come from a background where they are of the dominant culture, they miss out on hearing about the experiences of those outside the dominant culture. They don't get to hear the stories of those who might be marginalized, and they end up in an echo chamber. So on either side, we don't want to have the same story or the dominant culture story told, and then we then say this is privileged elite knowledge, and this is what you need to access if you are to ever to have any upward mobility. And at the same time, we need to make sure that we democratize knowledge, that we make sure that more stories are told. So powerful knowledge is knowledge that is more diverse, it is more representative, and it ensures that other stories are told, that we have that breadth and depth from many different perspectives, lenses, and viewpoints. Does that make sense?
It does. And actually, this is a very common thing for us when we're having a conversation. I disagree with you in all the ways in which I agree with you. And I absolutely get that. And I really, particularly when, you talk about obviously a lot of my examples are UK centric, but I have always felt that the people elected in the UK don't really understand the types of communities that they're serving very often. And that's something that, you've spoke to there. They're from that dominant culture and they don't understand the other cultures. And certainly, I'm thinking some of my favourite texts when I was at school, really enjoyed Othello when I studied at A-level, really identified with the character of Othello, not obviously all his actions, but he was a character I had great sympathy for. Couldn't be further from me, of course, in all the kind of the marginal, obvious ways. And yet that was a character that I felt very attached to. So there's that aspect of it, is that, actually, it does potentially give you the option to see people in different ways and see different lenses. And I could see an incredible value to sustaining something that I love very much, which would be Charles Dickens, because that gives insight into all different aspects of society. But you would also then see a purpose of teaching something like Face by Benjamin Zephaniah, for instance, in Key Stage 3, which is a really, really rich text about very different circumstances. So yeah, I absolutely get that. And I suppose the only concern I have is that those young people from underprivileged backgrounds, the reason I don't like that term, just by the way, is because certainly in my background, we were privileged in an awful lot of ways, despite not having a lot of money. But, underprivileged in those senses that we use that term quite generally, don't we? But from those people from the background, when they then enter into university, they often find themselves alienated. I know Matt Pinkett has spoken an awful lot about the alienation he felt attending Exeter University, which is, very elite and attracts a certain type of student. So, that makes an awful lot of sense to me, that you pick your race course, if anything, based on who's in front of you and based on perhaps widening the breadth of their experiences. Because sometimes when you talk about that, I'm confused as to how you would decide what to privilege. But that makes an awful lot of sense there, what you've said.
I think it's really interesting because I think that curriculum has become like a project, like almost a political project. It is interesting that it is out of kind of class differences and issues of upper mobility that the curriculum, like the national curriculum in England, was established. It was established with the idea that kids in some schools, so in private schools, for instance, were taught one curriculum, and it was seen as more elite, and it allowed them to speak with a language and navigate societies that they found it easier when they got to these esteemed, privileged places in universities, for instance. Where others without that knowledge, where it wasn't part of what they were taught in school, they were taught a different curriculum, they were then put at a disadvantage. And so we tend to see that with underserved communities, which is why the national curriculum was kind of brought about with the idea of being an equalizer so that all schools were teaching the same curriculum. Now, the national curriculum has kind of dissolved, and we've kind of allowed schools since then, for many, many reasons, to kind of develop curriculum that is specific to them and their context. But I think that teachers and leaders are very aware that we can't just use curriculum as, okay, these are the points that we need to cover, but we want curriculum to be a vehicle so that students are wonderful thinkers and intellectually curious. Now, we have to take a break now, as much as I'm loath to take a break, but we will be right back after the ads with some more really thought-provoking things about curriculum.
Parentkind are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour, and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at BetUK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at BetUK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Hello and welcome back. Todd and I are discussing curriculum, and we have bounced around a bit at the first part of this, just because curriculum intent matters a lot. And going into kind of curriculum intent means looking at how we structure curriculum. And as Todd said at the very beginning, it is the why. So the why is really, really important. The how is really, really important. And as we've kind of discussed, the who is really important. And I thought that we would just start off this next kind of section looking at kind of Christine Council and Mary Myatt, because I do feel like they have really articulated and shaped our discussions about curriculum. And Christine kind of focuses on curriculum as a tool for opening educational horizons. And she really believes that it is basically something that should be rich, broad, and inclusive. The very end goal of curriculum is that we should be able to engage with the world in a really thoughtful way, and that we should be able to encounter and engage with diverse perspectives. So I really love that. And I think Mary Myatt is kind of in the same vein. One of my favorite Mary Myatt quotes is, "A powerful curriculum is the means by which we can shape the lives of children for the better," which is a very, very simple statement that means a lot. So Todd, when you think about curriculum and you think about core values, I think that we've discussed how perhaps we could have discussions about what we want out of a curriculum at the very beginning, what those core values might be. Now that we've said these are our core values, how do we put everything together and how do we have progression? So we've picked out a few stories. We know what our core values are. How do we ensure that we build and have progression of our students through that journey over time? What is the thought process for that?
Well, I think you've mentioned Christine Counsell. I remember your excitement about her funnel explanation. And I think that idea of starting... Well, it was. I very much felt the same when I saw it. I remember being, when I first came into teaching, quite privileged to be quite cynical at times. And, you know, I remember thinking of Bloom's taxonomy and all those things and just thinking, this is very silly. This feels silly. And I couldn't quite articulate it for a long time. And then eventually sort of came to a way of articulating. But I still found that funnel explanation of with knowledge, you know, not at the base, but rather as the sort of the undergirding, if you like, of everything that goes after. I found that really, really useful. So I think which knowledge to privilege and which sequence to put that knowledge in is really important. And I often think about the knowledge that's selected should be useful now, later, as in, like, you know, endpoint exams or at the end of the year, and also in life. Now, you know, some knowledge might be temporary. It might just be useful just to get to that end point that you're looking at. And there's not much we can do about that, particularly with endpoint exams. But I do think that when we're selecting knowledge, we should be thinking also about that, about its utility. And you asked about sequencing. Well, you know, we're not free from any restrictions. But I think if we're thinking about the utility of knowledge and the structuring of it, obviously this is very subject specific, might be quite different to a biology teacher than to an English teacher. But I think if we're thinking of the structure of that knowledge, that's probably where I think next, after I've kind of gone through the values.
Yeah, I think that the funnel explanation, I think when we first learn about Bloom's taxonomy, we have this idea that at the very bottom, those little base factoids that we shoot at kids in class, remember the key words, those seem like so simple. We don't even count that as that important, because what we really want kids to do is analyze, evaluate, create. So that basic understanding at the very bottom of that pyramid is kind of seen as not as valuable, which is so silly, because the more of that base that you have, the bigger the pyramid you could build. So the idea of having this knowledge-rich curriculum, that is powerful. And so when we take that pyramid and we turn it on the side and we see that knowledge is the way that we funnel through comprehension, analysis, evaluation, we need all that great knowledge so that we're not just chat GPTing something on a very superficial level. That instead we have all those building blocks to really comprehend something. So I think we talk a lot about having a rich hinterland, and I love that term just as a geographer, because the idea of having a rich hinterland of knowledge that is behind us, that is what builds up our schemas so that we can do so much cool, fun stuff after. So making sure that we have lots of knowledge and that it's sticky and that it's linked together so that students can make connections, that is so much fun. And how we layer that in lesson after lesson after lesson, That is really interesting. And I think there's a joy in lesson planning. So if we choose the right stories that we're going to tell, and then we think about how we can sequence them in an interesting and exciting way that layers knowledge. There's a hook at the beginning of every single lesson. There is retrieval practice to make sure that we're constantly going back to get that really important, lovely knowledge so that students can play with it. That is when things get interesting. So when we're thinking about building a curriculum, that's the fun stuff.
Yeah, I think it was underprivileged for a long time because it's not super sexy. Teachers kind of ensuring that all the knowledge is there, that no gaps have opened up, that misconceptions don't exist. It doesn't feel as sexy as kind of saying, we're going to really analyze, we're going to get really creative now with this knowledge. That bit excites teachers, I think. I think it came out of that kind of, I think it is quite... I don't want to use the word selfish because it's not selfish. It's excitement. It's wanting to race ahead because that's the bit that excites you because you already have all that knowledge, hopefully. But I do think that's one of the fundamental problems here is teachers often want to get to the bit almost where they're at and they forget that they really are standing a couple of feet higher than the students. I've probably missed a step here actually as well. I think if I was helping someone redesign a curriculum, before we even spoke about the knowledge, I'd want them to think about what their subject is. What is the purpose of their subject? For me, I've spoken to you about this before, but English for me is about educating the heart. And I think to some extent as well, I talk a lot about mirrors, windows, and more recently fences. And what I mean by that is that I think as a subject, it's really important that we start by letting the students reflect inwards, thinking about who they are and their place in the world. Then obviously taking their eyes outside the window and looking at the rest of the world and, finding their grounding within it, before eventually going outside and looking back into the house and seeing where they've just been and where they are, from that lens. And now that then suggests a certain text and a certain set of units, but that's my initial thinking, and it'd be different for everyone. But that's my thinking. And I think that's my second step before I even then get to what is the knowledge. Now, for someone who's kind of going, right, exam board, what's our exam board? What things do they need to know to meet this exam board criteria? Oh, they're doing Romeo and Juliet. Let me Google all the mythology that's covered in Romeo and Juliet, stick it on a knowledge organizer, and then start teaching it from year 7 so that for that one endpoint exam, they know the mythological references in Romeo and Juliet. That's a very different lens. But I think the second step, the one that's skipped often, is what is this subject actually about? What are you doing? Why does geography exist? What is the purpose of it?
I think this is such a great question. So there's a few things that I kind of want to unpack there. The first is that, yes, we do want to do the fun stuff. So if I was an English teacher, I'd be like, okay, we're going to do a close reading of a text. But if you don't have the keyword vocabulary, you don't understand what those words mean, then you might not be able to access or really get a lot of meaning out of that close reading. It's the same way if I gave you a propaganda poster from World War II. Unless you have a lot of understanding about the context surrounding that, your source analysis isn't going to be that deep. And you'd really, as a teacher, have to really try to pull meaning out of it. But students wouldn't be able to attach that meaning to anything because they don't have enough knowledge necessarily yet to actually come to their own conclusions, or for that knowledge that you're trying to kind of stick at them to actually stay. So I think that's what knowledge rich is. That's why it's important that we get that bits of knowledge and really deep knowledge first. And the second point that you've made is, well, what's the grand end point? I remember when I was a head of faculty writing at the beginning of every single year in my department handbook, the purpose of our curriculum and the purpose of our department is to engender a love for these subjects. I wanted to engender a love of history, geography, and social studies because I felt it was so important. And for geography, that meant global citizenship, that you became an advocate for those things that matter all around you. So whether that's an advocate for human rights, for sustainability, all of those wonderful things, but you need to have an understanding of that first. But that's the endpoint goal. And I think what we haven't mentioned yet, but is pretty kind of prevalent when we look at curriculum design, is we look at backwards design. And I think that backwards design is often construed as, this is the exam board's points. This is what we want the students to know at the end so that they can pass a test. So this is how we're planning it out backwards from here. And that is not what backwards design is really about. Backwards design is about that larger intention about what we want. So when I gave the example of at my school, my science department are looking at Key Stage 3, and they're thinking at the end of year 9, we want our students to have a full appreciation of science, not of 3 separate disciplines with all of the little bits of knowledge that might go into that, but we want them to have scientific skills that they can use and interrogate, and we want them to see the linkages that are really important between physics and chemistry, between chemistry and biology, so that they will become, they will understand science a lot better and have a better understanding of the discipline as a whole, as opposed to just kind of churning through content of 3 different academic subjects. So their backwards design is to make a scientist, to have a student that loves science and has scientific skills, not to prepare students for IGCSE. They want to give them a more comprehensive skills than that. And I think that's a great intent to start from, because it will, no matter what, put them in a great position for the next stage of their educational journey.
Yeah.
So that is a lot that I've just said. So I will pause now.
I like that. I'm almost going a layer beneath that though, Morgan. So, just to be provocative for a second, what I'm talking about is, what is the purpose of science? Why does science exist? And I think, as silly as a question as it might seem, I actually think it's a really important one, because I want them to love geography. That's great. But, again, I'm being slightly provocative because I know it's not what you actually think, but it sounded like from your answer, you think the purpose of geography is to create activists. What I'm talking about is why does it exist? What is the purpose of that subject area?
I think it's really funny that you say that, because I used to put that on my my teaching philosophy. I do feel like the purpose of geography is to create activists.
Okay, and that's fine. Because my feeling there would be very different to yours, and it's not my subject area. But one of the reasons that I would have enjoyed geography at school was because I enjoyed the beauty of the natural world, and I thought that was something really. So if I was kind of writing that statement, mine would be different to yours, which is fine. But I think it's what that purpose is the real key second part after you've agreed upon what your community values are. So, for me, if I was going to start with a head of geography and I was line managing them, I'd say, don't you want them to notice the beauty of nature? Don't you want them to have a sense that this is something worth maintaining? Don't you want them to appreciate how these objects are interacting? It would be there that I would kind of start, because I think the purpose of science, for instance, is not necessarily to make scientists. I think the purpose of science is to be involved in a conversation about truth. But I'm not a scientist and I'm not a geographer. But these are really interesting conversations exactly because we don't necessarily agree. Now, I'm not a geographer, so my opinion is probably pretty pointless. But do you see what I mean? I think that conversation around the purpose actually really, really matters, because that then, you've said they're activists. Well, that's going to change what you teach, isn't it? It's going to change the way in which you teach it. It's going to make interrogation probably quite a fundamental aspect of what it is that you're doing. Does that, am I making sense here, Morgan? Do you see what I mean?
No, I think that as always, we completely agree. So when I say I want students to be activists, and you're like, well, I would say that geography is about protecting the natural world. I'd say exactly. Activists want to protect the natural world that is being rapidly depleting. I always think it's really funny because as a geography teacher, I will sit beside people at a dinner party and I won't tell them my job. And then they'll be talking about how they learned oxbow lakes in school. And that's their main takeaway from geography. And I always find like that's the saddest thing, that people think that geographers color in maps. I do not have my students color in maps. That does not make me a bad geographer. I just believe that in my curriculum, there are so many other things that are so important. I want my students to stand up and believe that we should protect the planet. I believe that we should look at human rights, and we should look at how we have interactions between nations that do damage, that we have interrelations in corporations that do damages because of the way that we've set up global systems. So my idea of a curriculum is one that does create activists that want to change the world. I think that geography is the most important subject because it is the one that says the future matters. There are real problems that need to be solved, and your job is to solve them. You don't have to become a geographer. We need physicists to help build a world where we can solve global warming. We need artists who can tell stories about Indigenous people's rights who are being infringed upon. But I think that as an activist, that is what I want my students to take away.
Yeah.
And I think that just like you said about truth, it's if I was to be a scientist, I say the big thing is truth is really about be curious and test. Ask a question, test it. Be curious and test. I'm not a scientist, but yeah, that's what I think it is. It's an interrogation of truth. I think that's very apt.
And then I would probably say I would much more lean down on the beauty aspect of nature, and perhaps that's because I went to school and really I absolutely adored the natural world around me. I loved the natural environment of Lancashire and felt completely uninspired by geography. I thought it was so boring because they'd be talking about the names of things and going, no, that one's an estuary. I'm like, I don't actually care. That one's a brook. I think
you care. I don't
really care
when you get the right story to care.
Yeah, but it was really strange as a child to be sat in a room with a bunch of people who, a lot of the kids in my school were city kids. They didn't leave the city particularly. They didn't go up to the Forest of Bowland and the Lake District, which was just on our doorstep. And so it's really weird to be in a room where you're being told you don't understand brooks and estuaries and all these things. You're thinking, nobody in this room apart from me has actually gone and visited one. This is ridiculous. But because you couldn't label them correctly. So I think that beauty aspect would be fundamental if I was in that conversation. But I really like your answer because they start and end at a very similar point. It needs protecting because it's beautiful. It's beautiful, therefore it needs protecting. But we've had a really rich conversation there about the nature of a subject I don't understand because we've started from the right place. So I think values of your community. I'll go back to it. So your place as a teacher and as a leader would be in a school that says, we believe that we should be valuable to our wider community. We believe we should be valuable locally and globally. And you'd say, I'm in at that school. I like that school. That's a good start point for me as a geographer. So values is the beginning for me. And then the next step is the purpose of your subject. And then the knowledge comes in, because then your knowledge, I wouldn't say it picks itself, but the privileging becomes much, much simpler, deciding what to privilege. So I've skipped a step there, but yeah, let's come back to knowledge after that. Really enjoyable detour, unless you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, we have to take a news break, but I will add this. I think that once you have your purpose and you answer that question, what I teach in geography will change from year to year. So I will teach, one year I'll look at the Balinese rainforest and I'll look at palm oil. Another year I will look at the Amazon rainforest. So I'm technically changing the curriculum, but my larger purpose will be the same.
Yes.
And I think what you've mentioned there about estuaries, that's how I'm teaching my curriculum. So I don't need to teach about estuaries or druids. I don't need to teach those things to get my message, my larger purpose across. And I think that looking at our curriculum that way is really interesting, because that's how we imbue it with our intention, and that's how we empower students. Now, we must take an ad break, but we have so much more to say, so please stick with us. We'll be right back.
It better be the Northern News.
Parentkind are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour, and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week features early feedback from the curriculum review led by Professor Becky Francis. According to the article, teachers feel disempowered and deprofessionalised by overstipulation and the challenge to cover content. Professor Francis said the roadshows have so far gathered mixed and diverse views. She spoke at the recent CST conference about how frequent complaints are around how assessment and exams dictate the curriculum, which is often described as overstuffed, and that this has led to the deprioritisation of certain subjects and reduced enrichment activities. Concerns have also been raised about a lack of awareness of vocational routes at post-16. Positive themes have included an appreciation of the ambition for all in the current national curriculum, and reading was mentioned as a thing that has gone well. The TES magazine covers draft proposals for changes to Ofsted's inspection framework. The magazine says Ofsted told sector leaders that teaching could be assessed as a separate category under new draft plans. The watchdog has been sharing its initial plans for inspection areas with a wide range of senior figures in recent weeks, ahead of a formal consultation launch in the new year. A report in the Financial Times has said that Ofsted is also proposing replacing its current grading system with a 5-point scale, in which schools would be rated as being exemplary, strong practice, secure, attention needed, or causing concern in each area. The TES reports there had been another version of the proposals that included a 7-point scale. Head teachers' leaders have raised concerns that Ofsted's plans are too complicated and warned that the Department for Education and the Inspectorate are in a headlong rush to create a new system. The plans involve separating out teaching and the curriculum into separate inspection areas, which have caused concern amongst those who have been consulted, particularly amid the recruitment and retention challenges. Teaching and curriculum are assessed together in the current framework. Ofsted's informal consultation comes after the Inspectorate was warned not to draw up its new framework behind closed doors. Other categories understood to be included in the new report card proposals include attendance, opportunities to thrive, outcomes, behaviour, leadership, preparation for next steps, and also inclusion. An Ofsted source told TES the proposal to make teaching a separate category was not about returning to lesson observations. Instead, it was about making it clear that the focus would be on how teachers are supported. The spokesperson said, "Great teaching is the most important lever schools have to improve pupil attainment for the most disadvantaged pupils." The Guardian reports on young people from working class backgrounds are being blocked from entering the creative industries, which remain elitist according to research. A report from the Sutton Trust found stark overrepresentation in the arts for those from the most affluent backgrounds. About 7% of people educated in the UK attend private fee-paying schools. However, 43% of Britain's best-selling classical musicians and 35% of BAFTA-nominated actors are alumni of private schools. However, pop stars appear to better reflect the educational backgrounds of the UK population, with only 8% privately educated and 20% university educated, which are both close to the national average. The report said, there are clear class inequalities in creative higher education, and the creative workforce with high-profile creative figures in fields like television more likely to have attended private school and university than the population overall. The Sutton Trust has called for a range of measures to improve access to the arts, with its chief executive saying it is a tragedy that young people from working class backgrounds are the least likely to study creative arts degrees. Further details, including a range of statistics, can be found in the article on the Guardian website. Finally, the Irish Times features a story on Ryanair's Michael O'Leary, who it says has doubled down on comments he made about teachers, saying he wouldn't generally employ a lot of teachers to go out and get things done. The comments have been condemned by many as insulting and failed to reflect the enormous contribution teachers have made to Irish society and enterprise. Mr. O'Leary was apparently unapologetic and said he was making a serious point. Full details can be found in the Irish Times online. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Hello and welcome back. That was Teachers Talk Radio News, and you're here with Morgan and Todd. We are discussing curriculum, and we have had a very wide-ranging discussion thus far, Todd.
Yeah, and that's okay, because I think we've kind of now got a little bit more, I can never pronounce it properly, Gallimaufry. We're moving to coherence, aren't we? But we've kind of had a little framework, which is that we've talked about knowledge and we've talked about decisions around the curriculum. And I've sort of used my outline that I would suggest, which is values, purpose of the subject, and then we're round to curriculum in terms of knowledge. And we'd sort of touched on Mary Myatt's Christine Council's funnel explanation. We talked about powerful knowledge and knowledge of the powerful, and we'd really picked that apart. And I think that's actually clarified a lot of my thinking. I hope it's done the same for other people. Do we need, do you think, to come back to this idea of which knowledge and sequencing of knowledge, or should we move to sort of disciplinary knowledge, do you think?
I think there is a lot to cover. I was just having a think. So disciplinary knowledge is really, really interesting. And I think we discussed that a little bit in our last podcast as well. I was thinking about also the difference between breadth and depth of learning. And what do you think? I think this is kind of an out there question. When we take a look at breadth and depth of learning, how does disciplinary knowledge fit into that kind of, well, we have to go wide, but we also sometimes want to go deep. How does it fit into that paradigm?
Well, I think this is a bit like work-life balance, and I'm torn on it because I don't really think that you can have both. I'm really not sure about this, particularly with the number of subject areas that we want to offer in schools. I'm just not sure that you can have both. I mean, it depends what you mean by breadth, doesn't it? I mean, how broad are we talking? You can go so broad as to sections of the school can cover broad ranges of the curriculum that you want to teach, the knowledge, the disciplinary knowledge that you want to teach. But you want to have that experience for all and the challenge built in for all as well, don't you? So I'm never really comfortable with these terms of breadth and depth. I would much rather students retained a lot of what they learned because it was important and it was really key and it was going to be useful in the long term. And so I would lean towards privileging depth over breadth, to be perfectly honest. And while that can mean a sort of a poverty of experience in some senses, at least what has been experienced has actually had some impact. And one in my notes, actually, if I flick through this book, is about the lack of reference, and I'm not criticizing Josh for any, he can't reference everything, but there's no reference particularly to experiential learning. And I think it is important what students experience, but I'm not sure that a broad and rich, a broad and deep curriculum, I think it's just rhetoric. I don't think it's actually possible. Does that come anywhere close to approaching your question or your angle here, Morgan?
No, well, I think disciplinary knowledge is kind of a separate issue, but I think breadth and depth is really fascinating, because let's look at knowledge. There's no such thing as a Renaissance man anymore. I think there's so much knowledge in the world. We are teaching. You are almost there. But I think there's so much knowledge in the world. We are teaching tiny slices of some disciplines, and we're teaching like a superficial amount. Basically, we are teaching wedges. We are teaching these tiny little wedges that allow our students to then specialize and investigate in things that they are passionate about further if they choose, at a higher level, but also we are preparing them to be future learners in the world. So I think that breadth allows us, again, that whole bunch of knowledge to allow us to interpret, make connections between things. Depth studies are really interesting. What I find fascinating is that when we take a look at something like English teaching or history teaching, with history, if you need to teach a new topic, you need to know that topic so well. The depth that you need to know that topic with makes it really, really hard if you are changing curriculum, because to go from teaching World War II to teaching civil rights in the US, that's an entirely different body of knowledge, new players. The skills are going to be very much the same, but the depth of detail that you need to know is extremely different. In order for a teacher to be able to then give students all of the riches that they need to then interrogate and use historical analysis. So I think that that's really interesting, that depth studies, because sometimes our disciplines are so huge, we don't realize that we're kind of subspecializing already. But I do believe that depth studies are really, really powerful, and that we should allow space for them in our curriculum, because it allows students to explore something under a microscope, and they can then compare it to other experiences that they learn about later. So I think that you and I are very alike in the sense that giving a case study, giving a depth study, going in deep and taking more time to cover one thing is more powerful and possibly, I would suspect, more impactful than trying to cram in as much content to say that we're getting a lot of breadth. And that's a hard thing to say, because of course we want our curriculum to have breadth.
Yeah, and of course, like when we think about this in terms of subject offer, which is perhaps the lens I'm using more than anything else, is yes, I would love my daughter and my sons to be able to code. I'd love them to be able to speak 4 languages and play 3 instruments. But in reality, that probably isn't going to happen. They're very talented young people. I hope they work very hard. I think they do. But those people that can do all those things are extremely, extremely rare people. And as life becomes increasingly more complicated and humans, need to specialize more later on in life, I think perhaps you've talked about wedges there. I often think about it's sort of world cuisine night and we're offering a ramekin, and the English table's going, this is shepherd's pie, but it's literally just a ramekin with some mash and beef in it. But it's a case that we're offering little looks into what we do. And I think if we're just kind of aiming for depth, then all that happens is there's just a little taste of lots and lots of things. And look, there's thousands and thousands of single stories of individuals who say things like, I just happened to walk into a ballet class because my karate was on next, and that was it, and that was me. That little slice I got changed my entire life. But I'm not sure that that's a great orientation. Happenstance is not perhaps how we should think about our subject offer, which is different to our curriculum. I appreciate that, but I think the two are obviously interchangeable. So, but yeah, I think depth in terms of the subject areas where possible is really important, and perhaps more important than trying to have a broad offer. I don't know, I can't remember, Morgan, if you've taught the American curriculum, but the American curriculum for geography and history is ludicrously broad. And those teachers I know who find it almost impossible. But there isn't a single American curriculum, of course, but the scope of what's been suggested historically is so ludicrously broad that I think it's almost nothing is retained when taught as designed, or when taught as displayed, I suppose is better.
I think that there are curriculums that kind of are life-changing. I was thinking about kind of interdisciplinary curriculums. I always like the idea of like, well, in order to teach about Florence Nightingale, you need to learn about germ theory as well. So there's natural linkages that are interdisciplinary that happen all the time. When I think about a curriculum that changed my life, there was a class that I took when I was in high school, and it was called Global Perspectives. And what Global Perspectives was that it looked at 10 different case studies of countries and problems throughout the world. So it would look at poverty and hunger throughout like sub-Saharan Africa. It looked at Antarctica and how Antarctica had melting glaciers. It just looked at different places and then problems that were happening there. And I remember I later went to university, and my first degree was in international development. And I was sitting down next to a whole bunch of other first-year university students. And international development is such an interesting subject. It is interdisciplinary: economics, politics, geography, history, and it's all about gaps. It's about studying gaps that exist between rich and poor countries, between rich and poor people, and it looks at equity. And I was sitting down with everyone that was around me in that very first introductory session. And when we were told to kind of introduce ourselves and say, well, why are you majoring in international development? I remember there was about 6 of us that said, I took Global Perspectives and it changed my life. And it was this one course, this one great curriculum that put us on a trajectory of what we wanted to study at university and all our careers since. So I think that there is something about a curriculum that can really drive someone. And again, that's powerful. I want to make sure that we have enough time for you to tell your kind of closing story about a special curriculum, because I know that you have one. Why don't we just do our last ad break, and then we're going to come back with our closing thoughts. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Parentkind are a national charity representing parent views and voice, and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour, and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
And we are back for our last 10 minutes or so of the show. So we're going to have to wrap up some of our very complex thoughts on this topic. Todd, I just finished telling a story about my favorite curriculum. What about you? When you look back at school, and this is kind of a cool question, actually, what do you remember?
Well, Yeah, I've alluded to the fact I don't remember very much about geography, but I didn't take it at the GCSE. And I remember the geography teacher revealing to my mum that she was quite delighted that I wasn't. So not a huge success over there.
Your loss, Todd.
No, it was very much their gain. But no, I remember, I think there was a anthology of poetry that was called Poetry from Different Cultures. And I've spoken about this before on the podcast, but T.S. Eliot and Wuthering Heights was introduced to us in year 9. And then we went into year 10 with this Scouse teacher who's now a fantastic head teacher in my hometown. And she taught us this poetry, and I just thought it was amazing. I thought the language was superb. I think it felt very much like song lyrics. It was a nice sort of in. And it really spoke to me. And the reason that actually it was very effective wasn't necessarily down to the curriculum. It was around to her implementation of it. But somebody had put together those poems in that particular order. And they were very much sort of coming of age in the UK in the early 2000s. So they were John Cooper Clarke, they were Simon Armitage, but they were also poems from other cultures. And at an age and stage in my life when really I'd been through the Catholic education system in what is quite a small city, and only really experienced my own culture. So these references to other cultures were fascinating to me in these other experiences. So that was probably something that really, really stayed with me. And then in terms of teaching, I think visiting, it's sometimes seen as controversial, but visiting Michaela School, who taught English chronologically at the time, I don't know if they still do, that was a really, really fascinating thing to me. So those would be two examples that jump to mind, but I'm not sure I have that real sort of light bulb moment, that real sort of change moment that you're describing there. It's more just a slow drawing in towards the subject that I teach. But yeah, I do have a lot of memories. And you mentioned about interdisciplinary. I have a lot of memories of history, of religious education, and of English as being quite intertwined in my mind. It was a few subjects where I got to do basically what we've done today. Debate, discuss, and pose ideas and get responses from people who actually knew some stuff. So those would be my memories, but they're not curriculum memories as such. It's just they're experiential, I suppose.
I think it's really fascinating. I'm working in a school that has the IB program, and they do the theory of knowledge. And in those classes, the theory of knowledge, it is interdisciplinary. It is kind of about intellectual provocation. It's looking at how to write a discursive essay. It's really fantastic. There's an exhibition at the end. They have to look at artifacts and interpret them. They're given prompts in which they have to take knowledge and then again play with it. TOK, or theory of knowledge, is fantastic for that. But I was thinking there are different curriculums that I've seen. I'm just kind of reading about. I'm trying to explore different curriculums that do exactly what you have just kind of said, that there are curriculums that we build with a specific intent in mind. So I'm thinking about some schools that really want to make sure that sustainability is at the forefront of everything. So we know some schools that their unique selling point is that they are an eco school, and they literally build sustainability into every single aspect and every single subject within their curriculum. And they have ways of highlighting it in certain ways. I've seen schools where they have an integrated STEAM curriculum. So STEAM and STEM are everywhere. I've seen schools that they put literacy, and they're embedding literacy in different subjects across the curriculum. There's schools that are looking at gender equity, and they very purposely have a gender equity curriculum that they build in to ensure that they can improve student outcomes because of the way and the how that they teach. And at my own school right now, one of the things that we did at the very beginning of the year is we looked at well-being, and we asked every single head of department to go back to their teams and to look at how well-being is embedded in their curriculum. So that students have those opportunities to reflect, that there are those opportunities to make sure that students take care of themselves and build tools like empathy. through the curriculum. And I think that's really fascinating. I think that, again, speaks to what you value as a school. It's not a bit of knowledge, but it's a perspective that you are giving to your curriculum, and that you're asking teachers to kind of contribute to, in how what they teach every single day.
Yeah, I
So
remember
I know that that's a lot, but yeah.
an awful lot, but I remember speaking to a head, and I've certainly mentioned him multiple times today, but I won't again, just embarrass people if you keep saying how great they are. But he just said very simply, I want children to leave this school and go and do good. And I just thought, well, that'll do. That's enough, right? So that means that you're enabling them, you're giving them the knowledge and the skills to do good, but you're also making sure that, and I think we've all encountered these people, very, very intelligent people who just aren't that nice. And as small as it seems, again, referencing Michaela, but I remember a teacher there saying to the students as they left the tutor time, work hard, be kind, be nice. And I don't think that was the official script, but this teacher had obviously made a point of adding that in. But it was something like that. And I think having that as your goal, and that's why there are so many schools, and that's why it's great that there's so much variety of schools, because as a parent then, if everyone's up front and everyone says, look, this is who we are, this is what we do, if this aligns with you, we're going to work great together, that obviously then helps. Gosh, we've darted around a lot. I really wanted to get to this idea of disciplinary knowledge and teaching students to contest the nature of knowledge within your subject area. I don't think we're going to get there. I'm not sure about that for a whole host of reasons. But we have absolutely covered wild ground, Morgan. And I think, as per usual, you did warn me that this would happen and perhaps we should narrow. So
yes, I said, well, that's a big topic, Todd. Do you want to make it very narrow? Which I think, again, we can do. I think that we could probably take that and make it its own podcast unto itself. But I think that Michael Young, he does say exactly that we should be able to contest knowledge. That's when we equip learners with the intellectual tools to respond to complexity. That is what we are asking them to do, to contest knowledge to begin with. And that's really, really powerful.
So we've not got to contesting knowledge, progress model. We haven't got to that. We touched on it very, very briefly. We wanted to get there. We've not mentioned so many things, but there are times, Morgan, when it can be hard to get a guest on, and we've got some fantastic people coming up. We can absolutely come back to this, and we can do curriculum 2. This time it's serious. And it can be the sequel to this, and we will absolutely hammer through the rest of those topics that we haven't quite got to today. Did you want to have a closing thought? This is such a complicated and complex job you guys do. We just talk nonsense, then Morgan gives it shape. I talk nonsense, then Morgan gives it shape. But thank you. Yeah, it is quite complicated. That's a comment we've had. Morgan, do you want to have a concluding thought here as we wind this up?
Yeah, well, I feel like I wanted to talk more about the importance of representation and diversity in the curriculum, but I thought I actually during the break looked up one of my favorite Michael Young quotes, and I thought that it might be a really nice way to kind of end the show. And he comments in 2014, the school, for all its tendencies to reproduce the inequalities of an unequal society, is the only institution we can have that, at least in principle, provides every student with access to knowledge. And as curriculum makers, we have the opportunity to equip our students with the knowledge to navigate the future. And I think that's beautiful and hopeful, and it really makes our job incredibly important. So when you hear in the news that we can't be trusted to run an airline, I think we are actually making every single person in the world fly. The curriculum that we teach and how we teach it is basically creating the next generation of thinkers. And so the work that we do every day is really valuable.
Yes, and just to finish on certain airlines, nobody should give that individual airtime. It just encourages him. But I can't say anything better than that, Morgan, because that is a fantastic quote to end on. Until we get back to curriculum 2, this time it's serious. Have a lovely weekend, a well-earned rest, and those out there listening, thank you for bearing with us. Thank you for your amazing questions. Get more into us and we'll try and cover even more ground when we come back to curriculum inevitably at some point. Morgan, thank you as always, giving shape to my absolute ramblings, but those 3 key points that we've covered: values, the purpose of the subject, selecting knowledge, and much, much more. Maybe that's our little blurb for this episode.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's been wonderful, as always. Have a really good weekend, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.